30 missed calls, 9 voicemails, 23 frantic text messages, and one final, desperate message that simply read, "Dad, please call me back." I was wrong. I made a fatal mistake. Please, I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, sitting alone in a small, dimly lit cabin overlooking the frozen expanse of Lake Logan in southern Ohio. Outside, the winter wind howled, driving heavy snow across the icy water in swirling, violent sheets. Inside, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic crackle of firewood burning in the stone hearth. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't move to answer it. For a long, silent moment, I just watched the screen go dark again. 2 days earlier, the man who was desperately trying to reach me, my own son, Daniel, had stood in front of a dining room full of guests and called me a pathetic old man. My own flesh and blood. The boy I had spent my entire life loving, protecting, and providing for. The boy I had worked grueling double shifts to feed, enduring freezing winters on construction sites and sleepless nights hauling freight. The boy I had raised after his mother, Martha, and I sacrificed nearly every comfort we had to secure his future. And now he wanted to talk. He wanted to apologize. But before I tell you why he called 30 times, before I explain the absolute hell I unleashed upon the man who manipulated him, I need to tell you exactly what happened on Christmas Day. My name is Harold Whitaker. I am 72 years old. I am a retired Army Ranger, a veteran of numerous classified deployments that I still don't talk about, a structural engineer by trade, and a widower. To the neighborhood, to my son, and to his wealthy, status-obsessed in-laws, I am just a quiet, aging handyman who drives a beat-up, 12-year-old pickup truck. I clip coupons. I buy my coffee at the local gas station instead of those overpriced downtown cafes. I live in a modest, single-story ranch house on the outskirts of Columbus. I keep my head down, I do my work, and I don't ask for much. And until that fateful Christmas dinner, I genuinely believed my son respected me. I was wrong. Christmas was always hard without Martha, but I still baked her pecan pie and drove to Daniel's house, hoping to keep the tradition alive. Her smile was frozen in time, warm and radiant. When I arrived, Daniel's house was packed with luxury cars and wealthy guests. My 2 young grandchildren spotted me immediately. "Grandpa!" They yelled in unison. That was when I noticed something was off. The massive oak dining room table had been completely rearranged. For the past 5 years, Daniel and Linda had hosted Christmas dinner. It was a new tradition, one I happily supported. Usually, my place was set near the head of the table, near the window. Not because I demanded a place of honor, not because I felt entitled to it. That was simply where I had always sat. It was the spot where Martha used to sit right beside me before she died. But this year, something was fundamentally different. Someone else was sitting in my chair. It was Frank, Linda's father. Frank was a heavy-set, loud-mouthed man who wore expensive tailored sweaters, flashed a gold Rolex on his thick wrist, and loved to remind everyone in the room exactly how successful his real estate development firm was. He was currently laughing loudly at his own joke, swirling a glass of expensive red wine in his hand, holding court at the head of the table like a king on a throne. I liked Frank well enough in the past. We weren't close, but we had always maintained a polite, distant cordiality. I frowned slightly, assuming there had simply been a mix-up with the place cards. I set the pecan pie down carefully on the kitchen island and walked over to where Daniel was standing by the refrigerator. "Hey, buddy," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. Daniel barely looked up from the screen of his smartphone. He was typing furiously, a tense, stressed look on his face. "Hey, Dad." I nodded subtly toward the dining room. "I think somebody might be in my seat. Did Linda mix up the cards?" Daniel finally glanced over his shoulder at Frank, then shrugged dismissively, returning his eyes to his phone. "Oh yeah, that was all. Just, oh yeah." I stood there, waiting for an explanation. I waited for him to say he would fix it, or at least offer a reason. But the explanation never came. He just kept typing, completely ignoring the fact that his father was standing there waiting. Finally, keeping my voice calm, I asked, "So where exactly am I sitting this year?" Without looking up, Daniel pointed a finger toward the far corner of the room. "Over there." I followed his finger. Sitting near the drafty entrance to the kitchen, pushed up against the wall, was a cheap metal folding chair. It wasn't even at the main table. It was separated, isolated off to the side, completely excluded from the family gathering, like an afterthought. Like a nuisance they had to accommodate out of obligation. Linda, my daughter-in-law, walked over holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She was dressed in a pristine silk dress, a perfectly manicured smile plastered on her face. "We had to make some adjustments this year, Harold," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, condescending sweetness she used when she wanted to avoid an argument. "My father is hosting some of his major business partners tonight, and we needed a better arrangement to accommodate the important guests." A better arrangement? Something cold and hard settled in the pit of my stomach. Every instinct from my military days flared up, the ability to read a room, to spot a threat, to recognize when the dynamic of a situation had completely shifted against you. Frank wasn't just sitting in my chair. He was asserting dominance. He was showing everyone in that room who the true patriarch of this family was. And Daniel was letting him do it. I didn't want to ruin Christmas for the grandchildren. I didn't want to cause a scene, so against my better judgment, I swallowed my pride, grabbed a plate, and walked over to the folding chair. Dinner officially started about 30 minutes later. The room was packed. There were neighbors, a couple from Linda's exclusive country club, members of her church committee, and several of Frank's wealthy associates, whom I had never met in my life. The noise level was deafening, a cacophony of clinking silverware and boastful conversations about stock portfolios, European vacations, and luxury car leases. I sat quietly in the corner, eating my turkey, completely ignored by the rest of the room. Then, the moment happened, the moment that shattered everything. During a lull in the conversation, one of Frank's business partners, a slick-haired man in a three-piece suit, leaned over and pointed his fork in my direction. He looked at Daniel with a condescending smirk. "So, Daniel," the man asked loudly, ensuring the whole table could hear, "who's the quiet fellow in the corner? Your handyman? Did you invite the help to dinner?" The question wasn't innocent. It was designed to mock. I sat up straighter, wiping my mouth with a napkin, preparing to introduce myself politely. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, Daniel laughed. He actually laughed. It wasn't a nervous chuckle. It was a loud, genuine laugh aimed at appeasing the wealthy men at the table. He took a long sip of his expensive wine, smiled at the executive, and said words that will remain burned into my memory for the rest of my life. "Oh, him? That's just my dad." The room went uncomfortably quiet. The clinking of silverware stopped. Daniel leaned forward, playing to his audience, trying to secure his place among these arrogant men. "He's just a pathetic old man who still thinks people want to hear his dusty old military stories and tales of fixing leaky pipes. Best to just let him sit there and ignore him." The silence in the dining room became absolute. I felt every single pair of eyes turn toward me. Frank sat in my old chair, a smug smirk playing on his lips. Daniel chuckled again, a desperate, hollow sound, looking around the table as if he had just delivered a brilliant punchline. Linda smiled nervously, her eyes darting between me and Frank. Nobody else laughed, not a single person. I sat there, frozen on that cheap metal chair, staring down at my half-eaten plate of food. My face felt hot, my hands, resting on my knees, slowly balled into tight fists, the knuckles turning white. But I wasn't angry, not at first. Anger is a hot, loud emotion. What I felt was entirely different. I was hurt, deeply, profoundly hurt, because the insult wasn't really about military stories. It wasn't about being a handyman. It wasn't about the folding chair. It was about something far more fundamental. It was about respect. In that agonizingly silent moment, a painful, undeniable truth crystallized in my mind. My son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, had stopped respecting me a very long time ago. This was simply the first time he felt empowered enough by the presence of his wealthy in-laws to say it out loud. Memories of my grueling sacrifices for him flooded my mind, working double shifts, selling my prized fishing boat, sacrificing everything to pay for his engineering tuition. I looked at the man sitting near the head of the table. He wasn't a man of honor. He was a coward, desperately seeking validation from arrogant people who would discard him the second he wasn't useful. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. I simply stood up. The screech of the metal folding chair against the hardwood floor sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I calmly placed my napkin on the table. I looked around the room one last, lingering time. I looked directly into Frank's smug eyes, and then I looked at Daniel. His smug smile faltered slightly as he met my gaze, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. I turned my back on them and walked quietly out of the dining room. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody called out my name. Nobody asked where I was going. I walked straight to the towering Christmas tree in the living room, carefully placed the gifts I had brought underneath its branches, picked up my heavy canvas coat from the hook, and walked out the front door. I walked out into the freezing blizzard. I climbed into the freezing cab of my old Ford truck, the leather seat cracking under my weight. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life with a familiar rumble. I shifted into gear and drove away into the whiteout. I had no destination in mind. I only had one absolute certainty burning in my chest. For the first time in my 72 years of life, I needed to be somewhere my son wasn't. And as the snow-covered roads stretched out endlessly ahead of me, blending into the dark winter night, I made a firm, unshakable decision. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and powered it off completely. I would not answer my phone, not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not for a very long time. What I didn't know, what none of the arrogant people sitting comfortably in that warm dining room could possibly know, was that before this Christmas was over, a forgotten secret buried for nearly 40 years was about to surface. And it was going to change absolutely everything. It was going to trigger a chain of events that would strip away the facade of Frank's wealth, expose the truth of my past, and leave the people who mocked me begging for mercy. The storm had only just begun. The first night after I walked out of Daniel's house, I drove aimlessly for nearly 3 solid hours. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. I just knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that I couldn't go home. My modest ranch house suddenly felt far too quiet, far too empty, and overflowing with the ghosts of happier times. Every single Christmas since Martha passed away had been difficult, a test of my endurance, but this one felt entirely different. This one didn't just feel lonely. This one felt like a betrayal. The cold sting of Daniel's words, a pathetic old man, echoed endlessly in the cab of my truck, competing with the howling wind outside. I eventually found myself pulling into a small, familiar lodge near Lake Logan. The heavy wooden doors of the lodge creaked open, and the rush of warm air was a welcome relief. The current owner recognized me almost immediately. "Harold Whitaker?" he asked, his eyes widening in surprise from behind the polished wooden reception desk. I offered a tired, strained smile. "Bobby, it's been a long time. I'll be damned if you haven't gone completely gray." Bobby. The owner recognized me and handed me a key to cabin 4. Inside the cabin, I ignored my phone and stared at the fireplace. The next morning, the crushing disappointment set in. I missed the little boy he used to be before status and wealth changed him into a stranger. That morning, as I sipped my coffee, my phone vibrated again. I assumed it was Daniel calling to make excuses. I almost ignored it, but when I glanced at the screen, the caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize. An out-of-state area code. Normally, I wouldn't have answered, but my gut instinct, an instinct honed by years of reading dangerous situations, told me to pick up. "Hello?" I said, my voice rough from disuse. "Mr. Harold Whitaker?" A professional, crisp female voice asked. "Speaking. My name is Susan Keller. I am a senior attorney with Keller, Monroe and Associates in Chicago." I frowned, setting my coffee mug down on the windowsill. "Okay, I apologize for taking your call on a holiday weekend, Ms. Keller. What can I do for you?" There was a brief, professional pause on the line. "I am contacting you regarding the estate matters of a deceased client of ours, Mr. Walter Jennings." The name hit me like a jolt of electricity. Walter Jennings. I leaned forward in my chair. Good Lord, Walter and I had served together in the Rangers decades earlier. We weren't inseparable best friends, but we had bled together, fought together, and survived together. That creates a bond that time doesn't erase. We had stayed in sporadic touch over the years, exchanging letters and the occasional phone call, but I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 years. "Walter passed away?" I asked quietly, feeling a sudden wave of heavy sadness. "I'm afraid so, Mr. Whitaker. He passed away peacefully 2 weeks ago. He was a good man." I murmured. "A damn good soldier. He thought very highly of you as well, sir," Susan continued, her tone shifting to strict business. "I am calling because there are several highly important financial documents requiring your immediate review and signature." "What kind of documents?" I asked, confused. "If Walter left me a memento or something, you can just mail it." "They are investment and equity transfer records, Mr. Whitaker." I let out a short, genuine laugh. "Ms. Keller, with all due respect, you have the wrong Harold Whitaker. I don't have an investment portfolio. I'm a retired handyman on a fixed pension." "No, sir. I have the correct file," Susan replied smoothly. "According to our records, you hold a significant equity stake." That got my full attention. "What exactly are you talking about?" Susan explained that decades ago, I had invested $5,000 in my Army buddy Walter's struggling tech startup. That startup had eventually grown into a massive aerospace manufacturer, which was recently acquired. When Susan finally arrived at the final number, my percentage of the buyout, I nearly dropped my phone. "Excuse me," I rasped. She repeated the number. I still couldn't believe it. It wasn't thousands. It wasn't hundreds of thousands. It was millions, multiple millions of dollars, legally mine, sitting in an escrow account, waiting for my signature. I sat in absolute silence. The crackling of the cabin fireplace was the only sound in the room. Susan eventually asked, "Mr. Whitaker, are you still on the line?" "Yeah," I rubbed my forehead, feeling a headache building behind my eyes. "Yeah, Miss Keller, I'm here. Would you like me to explain the tax figures again?" "No," I said softly. "I heard you clearly. I wasn't excited. I only wished Martha were here to share this moment." But as the initial shock faded, my military training kicked back in. My mind cleared. I thought about Frank. I thought about the arrogant smirk on his face, his expensive Rolex, and his boastful talk about real estate dominance. Something about Frank hadn't sat right with me at that dinner. He was too loud, too desperate to show off. A truly wealthy, powerful man doesn't need to steal a folding chair from a 72-year-old handyman to prove his worth. I opened my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 3 years. It belonged to Marcus, a former intelligence analyst who now ran a private security consulting firm. "Harold," Marcus answered on the second ring, sounding surprised. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Marcus, I need a favor, a deep dive, fast. Give me a name. Frank Sterling, real estate development out of Columbus. I want to know his actual net worth, not his public relations net worth. I want his debts, his active loans, his shell companies. Everything. Give me an hour," Marcus said, and hung up. Exactly 45 minutes later, Marcus called back. His voice was grim. "Harold, your guy Frank is drowning. He's not just broke, he is facing catastrophic financial ruin. His real estate firm over-leveraged on a massive commercial project that went belly up 2 years ago. He's hiding behind dummy corporations, but the banks are closing in. He's roughly $6 million in the red. He's desperate." "How desperate?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "Desperate enough to commit fraud." I intercepted some digital chatter. "Frank is currently trying to secure a high-risk, private equity loan to cover his immediate debts and avoid federal indictment. But he doesn't have the collateral. So what is he using? He's using a residential property. A 2-story colonial in the suburbs, valued at roughly $800,000. The deed is listed under a Daniel Whitaker." My blood ran ice cold. A chilling, terrifying realization washed over me. Frank wasn't just an arrogant loudmouth. He was a predator. He had systematically manipulated Daniel, feeding his ego, integrating himself into the family, separating Daniel from me, all for one singular purpose. Frank was manipulating my son into signing over his house as collateral for a fraudulent loan. When Frank inevitably defaulted, the private equity firm would seize the house. Daniel, Linda, And my beautiful grandchildren would be thrown out onto the street, completely ruined. The fatal mistake hadn't just been Daniel insulting me. The fatal mistake was Frank, believing he had sidelined the only man who could stop him. Frank thought I was a pathetic, ignorant old handyman. He didn't know I had spent 30 years hunting predators for a living. He didn't know I now had the financial firepower of a multi-millionaire to absolutely crush him. While I was mobilizing my resources, back in Columbus, Daniel was beginning to unravel. The next morning, Daniel had called me for the first time. No answer, then another call. No answer. By noon, panic started to set in. He drove to my house. The driveway was empty. The porch lights were off. He used his spare key and went inside. The house was exactly as I had left it. Martha's photograph sat perfectly on the mantel. The kitchen was spotless, but I was gone. That was when Daniel noticed the thick overnight FedEx envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. It had been delivered the previous afternoon from Keller, Monroe and Associates. Normally, Daniel would never snoop through my mail, but he was terrified. An elderly man vanishing in the middle of a winter storm was a serious matter. He tore open the envelope. Inside were the copies of the legal documents Susan Keller had mailed to me ahead of our meeting. Ownership records, corporate acquisition notices, certified financial statements, and a letter explicitly outlining my multi-million-dollar equity payout. Daniel read the documents, then he read them again. His hands began to shake. His father wasn't just a poor, struggling handyman. His father was a secret millionaire. But it wasn't the money that broke Daniel, it was what he found next. Desperate to understand who I really was, he opened the old filing cabinet in my home office. He found my military commendations medals and classified service records he never knew existed. And then he found a thick manila folder labeled simply, Daniel Education. Inside that folder were decades of carefully preserved receipts. College tuition payments, housing costs, textbook receipts. And tucked near the very back was the original bill of sale for my beloved fishing boat. Attached to it was a small, faded yellow sticky note written in Martha's neat handwriting. Harold sold the boat today, so Daniel can afford the engineering program. Don't ever tell him, it would only embarrass him. Daniel collapsed into the office chair, staring at the note. For years, he had looked at me and seen a man who hadn't achieved much in life. What he hadn't seen, what his arrogance had blinded him to, was a man who had intentionally stripped away his own dreams so his son could fly. Daniel pulled out his phone and started dialing. He called, and he called, and he called. 30 times. He left voicemails, his voice cracking, begging for forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't on my agenda right now. Retribution was. I packed my duffel bag, left the cabin key on the table, and walked out into the cold. I had a dinner date to interrupt. The next afternoon, we agreed to meet at a small, unassuming diner located roughly halfway between Columbus and Lake Logan. It was an old-fashioned establishment just off Route 33, the kind of place with peeling laminated menus, vinyl booths, and a waitress who kept the bitter black coffee flowing without asking. Decades ago, long before the world became obsessed with appearances, Martha and I used to eat here. Daniel arrived before I did. When I walked through the glass door, the bell jingling above my head, I spotted him sitting in a booth near the back. He didn't look like the confident, affluent suburban host from Christmas dinner. He looked like the young, uncertain man who had left for college 20 years earlier. He looked exhausted, defeated, and profoundly human. His shoulders were slumped, and he was staring blankly into his coffee mug. He stood up immediately. When he saw me approach, neither of us reached out for a hug. Neither of us offered to shake hands. The chasm between us was still too wide. We simply sat down across from each other. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. The diner buzzed around us, but our booth was enveloped in heavy silence. Finally, Daniel looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. "I deserve this," he whispered, his voice cracking. The silence, I deserve it. I took a slow sip of my coffee, keeping my expression entirely neutral. Deserve what? Dad, I was awful. He looked down at his trembling hands resting on the formica table. I don't know when I became that person. I don't know how I let myself get so twisted up. The folding chair wasn't the problem, Daniel, I said evenly. The joke wasn't the problem, either. He squeezed his eyes shut. I know the problem, I continued, letting the weight of my words settle between us. Is that you meant it. You don't make comments like that in front of strangers, unless those thoughts have already been living comfortably inside your head for a very long time. Daniel nodded slowly, a tear slipping down his cheek. He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer a single excuse. You're right, I was embarrassed. Embarrassed? I raised an eyebrow. By what? He swallowed hard. By the way you live, Linda's family, Frank. They have so much money. Their friends talk about massive investments, European vacations, private country clubs. And every time they asked about my family, every time they asked what my father did, I felt like you didn't fit in. I felt like a failure by association. The diner suddenly felt incredibly quiet. For years, my son had been measuring human worth using a completely broken ruler. Money, status, appearances, the shallow things that impress strangers, rather than the deep things that anchor a soul. Do you know what your mother used to say? I asked softly. Daniel shook his head. She used to say that character is what remains after everything else gets taken away. If you lose your money, you're still a person. If you lose your prestigious job, you're still a person. But if you lose your character, I let the sentence hang, then you've lost everything. Daniel finished, his voice breaking. He looked up at me, true shame radiating from his face. I found the folder, Dad, the tuition receipts, the bill of sale for the boat, Mom's note. I nodded slowly. I wasn't surprised. I didn't know, he sobbed quietly. I had no idea you gave up so much. You never told me. Parents don't advertise their sacrifices, Daniel. We don't want applause. We just want our children to have the opportunities we didn't. Before Daniel could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled violently. I looked up, striding down the aisle, looking frantic and furious, was Frank. His expensive tailor's sweater was rumpled, and his face was flushed red with anger. He had obviously tracked Daniel's phone location. He stormed up to our booth, ignoring me completely, and slammed a thick manila folder onto the table in front of Daniel. Daniel, where the hell have you been? Frank barked, his loud voice drawing stares from the neighboring booths. I've been calling you all morning. We have a deadline. The equity firm needs your signature on the collateral documents by 3 o'clock today, or the entire deal collapses. Daniel looked up, startled, wiping his eyes. Frank? Sue told you I needed a few days to think about the second mortgage. I'm dealing with a family issue right now. Frank scoffed loudly, finally acknowledging my presence. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. A family issue? You mean him? You're jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar commercial investment to have coffee with your handyman father? The sheer arrogance of the man was breathtaking. Frank, Daniel started, his voice trembling. Please, not now. No, right now. Frank snarled, tapping the folder aggressively. Sign the damn papers, Daniel. We are family. We help each other. You don't need financial advice from a man who clips coupons to buy groceries. I had heard enough. The time for observation was over. The time for retribution had arrived. He's not signing anything, Frank, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute, icy authority of a military commander issuing a final order. Frank sneered at me. Excuse me. Keep your mouth shut, old man. This is high-level business. You wouldn't understand a word of it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lose my temper. I simply reached inside my heavy canvas coat, pulled out the thick dossier Marcus had securely emailed to me, and I had printed at a local shop, and dropped it onto the table directly on top of Frank's folder. I understand wire fraud perfectly well, Frank, I said calmly. Frank froze, the color instantly drained from his face. I understand, I continued, leaning forward, my eyes locking onto his, that your vaunted real estate firm is currently $6 million in debt. I understand that you defaulted on 2 major commercial loans last month. I understand that the banks are preparing to seize your assets, and you are desperately trying to secure a high-risk private equity loan to cover your tracks. Frank's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. Daniel stared at me in absolute shock. And I also understand, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register, that you were planning to use my son's house as collateral for a loan you mathematically cannot repay. You were going to let him and his family be thrown out onto the street, just to buy yourself a few more months of pretending to be rich. That's a lie, Frank stammered, sweat breaking out on his forehead. You're a crazy old man, page 4, I said coldly, pointing at the dossier. Copies of your default notices, page 7. The federal tax liens against your shell companies. I spent 30 years tracking down threats to this country, Frank. You think a 2-bit real estate scam is going to slip past me? Frank stared at the documents. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. His entire empire of lies had just been utterly dismantled by the man he had forced to sit in a folding chair. Get away from my son, I ordered, the steel in my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. If you ever contact him again, if you ever ask him for a single dime, I will personally hand this entire dossier over to the FBI field office in Columbus. And they will bury you under the prison. Frank didn't say another word. He grabbed his empty folder, turned on his heel, and practically ran out of the diner. The silence returned to our booth. Daniel was staring at me, his mouth hanging open in pure astonishment. Dad, he breathed, is that true? Every word, I said, sliding the dossier over to him. He was going to ruin you, Daniel. Daniel buried his face in his hands, completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of his mistakes and the sheer disaster he had narrowly avoided. He had traded his father's respect for a con man's approval. I'm so sorry, he sobbed. I am so sorry. I stood up, walked around the table, and put my hand on his shoulder. The same shoulder I had patted after Little League games. The same shoulder I had held when his mother died. You made a mistake, Daniel, a catastrophic one. But mistakes don't define us. What we do after them does. He stood up and pulled me into a desperate, crushing hug. It was the kind of hug fathers remember forever, the kind sons rarely give once they become men. I hugged him back, and somewhere deep inside, a massive, bleeding wound finally began to heal. The months that followed were not perfect. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. It is rebuilt through consistent effort. Daniel worked incredibly hard. He cut ties with Frank completely. He started visiting me every week. One Saturday, he showed up unannounced with a toolbox and spent the entire weekend repairing my back deck, simply because he wanted to. Then, before I knew it, another Christmas arrived, exactly 1 year later. When I walked into Daniel's house, the grandchildren ran toward me with the same joyous energy. The house smelled identical, but as Daniel led me toward the dining room, everything felt different. The tension was gone. He stopped at the entrance and pointed. Positioned perfectly, at the head of the massive dining table, was a brand new chair. It was beautifully handcrafted oak, sturdy and strong. Daniel cleared his throat, looking at his family. This seat belongs to my father, the strongest, most honorable man I have ever known. I sat down, surrounded by the people I loved. For the first time in many years, my family felt entirely whole again. If you are fortunate enough to still have someone in your life who sacrificed for you, do not wait to tell them. Do not assume they already know, because respect given late is still infinitely better than respect never given at all. Family, when cared for properly, is the only treasure that truly grows more valuable with time.